Well, I hate to stop all the good visiting, but it's time to get started with our class this morning. Good to see everybody. Everybody seems to be doing pretty well this morning and in a good mood and visiting, and so glad to see that. So glad to be able to be together this morning. We've still got more rolling in outside, but it's time to get started. I want you to open your Bibles today to Luke chapter 23. We've been spending a lot of time here lately in Matthew's gospel, but I want to look at Luke because the point that we're to in the life of Christ, I think Luke is going to give us a little bit more detail that we don't see in Matthew's account. And so we're going to spend some time today in Luke chapter 23. Luke chapter 23. Dad, would you lead us in prayer to start our class?
Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day and for another opportunity to come in and study your word. Dear God, we pray as we go through this morning study session and later on through the service that we would all take something home with us that will bring us closer to you. Dear God, we pray for those that are sick that couldn't be with us. We pray for those that are traveling, that you watch over them. Dear God, we especially pray for those that have lost loved ones. We pray that you would give them peace. God, we pray that you watch over us and guide us in Jesus' name.
Amen. Let's begin reading at the first of the chapter. We're going to read down several verses before we make any comments this morning. Luke chapter 23, beginning in verse 1. And the whole multitude of them arose, led him to Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, We found this fellow perverting the nation and forbidding to give tribute to Caesar, saying that he himself is Christ, a king. And Pilate asked him, saying, Art thou the king of the Jews? And he answered him and said, Thou sayest it. Then said Pilate to the chief priests and to the people, I find no fault in this man. And they were the more fierce, saying, He stirreth up the people, teaching throughout all Jewry, beginning from Galilee to this place. When Pilate heard of Galilee, he asked whether this man were a Galilean. And as soon as he knew that he belonged unto Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who himself also was at Jerusalem at this time. So let's stop right there for just a moment. As we've talked in previous lessons, Jesus has been arrested while he was there praying in the garden. That night, he was taken before the Sanhedrin Council, and they, as we've discussed, spent quite a bit of time trying to find false witnesses, ones that, for lack of better terminology, would be credible enough that the Roman officials would believe what they had to say. So much of what was being said was so outlandish that they knew that it wouldn't be believed. Well, finally, they found two witnesses. Two that they thought were credible enough. Well, they reasoned together and they determined, which in my opinion they knew from the outset what they wanted to do with Jesus, but they determined that they wanted him put to death. Well, the only way that the Jews were able to carry this out per the agreement that they had with the Romans. The Jews were allowed to self-govern up to an extent. They were allowed to punish their own people up to a certain extent. And that threshold was death. They could not carry out capital punishment. If they had someone that they felt was worthy of being put to death, then that charge had to come down from a Roman official. So the next morning, early in the morning, they get together and they bring Jesus before the Roman governor, the one that was legislating that region of Judea at the time, a man by the name of Pilate. Well, Pilate begins to talk to Jesus, and he listens to the charges that are being levied against Jesus. And he asks Jesus point blank. He says, are these things true? Are you the Christ? Are you who these people are saying you are? And Jesus' response to him is not, yes, I am, but his response is, it is as you say it. Basically, it's the truth. You've said the truth. Well, Pilate, he cannot find anything in these charges that he believes is worthy of death. As we're going to see, he tries to placate the Jews in other ways. And we'll look at that a little bit in just a few minutes. But all along, Pilate is trying to find a way to extricate him from this position. In many courts of law today, if a judge believes there's a conflict of interest or something of that nature, he's able to extricate himself from that. He's able to remove himself or herself from that position in order to bring someone in that would be impartial. Well, Pilate's trying to find a way that he can get out of this because he does not believe that Jesus is worthy of death. Well, the first thing that he does, he hears that the people are saying that Jesus started out stirring the people up in Galilee. So the first thing that pops into Pilate's mind, well, hey, if this man's not Judean, then that's not my jurisdiction. If this all started in Galilee, then he needs to go before Herod. Herod was the one who was reigning over that region, the region of Galilee. Well, when he ascertained that Jesus was indeed Galilean and that he had began his ministry in Galilee, Pilate thought, hey, I've got out of this. I'm going to send him to Herod. Now, this Herod, and we're actually going to talk about the Herods a little bit more in our question and answer session tonight, but this Herod that was reigning at this point was not the same Herod that was alive and reigning at the time Jesus was born. This Herod was known as Herod Antipas, and this would have been the son of Herod the king, or as history has recorded, Herod the Great. These were men who reigned over the region of Galilee for about 3 or 4 generations before the Romans stepped in. They said, you know what, there's so much animosity between the Jews. The Herods are not maintaining peace. We got to do something different. So here we have the son of the man that had already tried to kill Jesus when he was a newborn. Well, here was a man, as we see in verse 8. When Herod saw that Jesus was coming before him, he got excited. No doubt he knew the story about his father. No doubt he knew these claims about there being another king, a king of the Jews. No doubt he had heard about Jesus and the things that were going on in his region. So he was excited that he was going to get to see Jesus and question Jesus and learn more about him. Now, it wasn't that he was curious spiritually. He was simply curious as to who this man is. What kind of a person is this? It wasn't that he wanted to follow Jesus, but he just had a curiosity about the things that he had heard about Jesus. So verse 8 says that Herod was exceeding glad, for he was desirous to see him of a long season. This is something he's been wanting for a long time. I want to see Jesus. I want to have an audience with him and question him and see what he's really like. But also, it says he wanted this because he had heard many things of him and he hoped to see a miracle. He hoped that Jesus would do some type of wonder before his eyes, something that would be amazing to him. But then picture this image that's portrayed as we continue on down. Then he questioned with him in many words. So Herod's here, he's asking Jesus all these questions, wanting Jesus to answer him, but Jesus says nothing. answers him not a word. The chief priests and the scribes, verse 10, they stood up and they vehemently accused him. Very passionately. This is something that he has done wrong. He has stirred up the people. He's perverted the nation. This nation's no longer at peace because of what Jesus had done. Well, verse 11, and Herod with his men of war set him at naught, and they mocked him. They arrayed him in a glorious robe and sent him again to Pilate. So here you have Herod. Herod is asking Jesus all these questions. Well, of the things that Herod has heard about Jesus, Jesus is a popular man. People are following him. They're listening to the things he has to say. They're witnessing all of these miracles. But what's Herod able to get out of Jesus? Nothing. Not a word. Now, many commentators look at this and they say that Herod more than likely looked at this situation and thought, you know what, this man, there's nothing to this man. This man is either crazy or there's something there. There's no reason for us to give any attention to this man. But yet, Herod really didn't care what the Jews thought. He wasn't as much of a diplomat as Pilate was. Herod was going to do what Herod wanted to do. And that's part of the reason why eventually that succession of kings was removed by the Romans. Because these people were put into power to keep the peace in their regions. The Herods didn't care. So here you have the Jews. They're saying, well, this man claims to be a king. He claims to essentially be equal with Caesar. So you see, once again, they're trying to find not only a spiritual aspect, but a secular aspect that they can use to bring about these charges. Well, Jesus won't say anything. So Pilate, he decides, well, we'll have a little bit of fun out of this situation. So he takes Jesus out when it says that he set him at naught. Literally, it means that he took him out and he set him in a prominent place. And they took this beautiful robe, a sign of royalty. And they put this robe upon Jesus. They mocked him, taunting him. And a lot of this, it wasn't necessarily to tear down Jesus, but it was to stir up the Jews. Pilate was having fun with the situation. But then when Herod got tired of it, he said, you know what, I'm done with this man. You can take him back to Pilate. I'm not going to give you what you want. I'm not going to entertain this any longer. If you want to seek these charges any further, you're going to have to go back to where you came from. Go back to Pilate. These charges that you say, they must be things that took place in Judea, because Jesus isn't going to answer any of those things here. So he sent him back to Pilate. Well, the same day, notice what it says. The same day, Pilate and Herod became friends. Up to this point, there had been some type of animosity there. History has not recorded what had happened between these two men that brought about this animosity. But it's generally accepted that due to the common courtesy that Pilate displayed to Herod by sending this man to him when he felt like it was in Herod's jurisdiction, that this developed goodwill between the two men. And from that point forward, they had a more amiable relationship with each other. This enmity between these two rulers was torn away, and they were friends from that point forward. Well, Pilate thought he had got out of it. He thought, well, Herod's going to handle this situation for me. I won't have to do anything. Well, now we come down to 13, and Herod has sent him back to Pilate. Pilate, when he had called together the chief priests and the rulers of the people, said unto them, Ye have brought this man unto me as one that perverteth the people. And behold, I, having examined him before you, have found no fault in this man touching those things whereof ye accuse him. So he says, you've brought this man to me. I've questioned him in your presence. He says, I don't see where this man has done anything worthy of what you want done to him. And so what we're going to start seeing at this point, Pilate's going to try to come up with some lesser form of punishment. Something else that he can do, or some other tactic to get Jesus off of these charges. So he comes before the people and he says, I don't see where this man's done anything wrong. I don't see where he is worthy of the punishment that you're wanting to bring down upon him. Verse 15, no, nor yet Herod. He said Herod didn't find anything wrong either. He said Herod sent him back to me. And lo, nothing worthy of death is done unto him. He said, all these things that you're saying, all these charges you're bringing against him, he said, we're not seeing this. Other than these few people that are coming before us, we've not seen any kind of seditions in the nation. We've not seen an uproar. We've not seen any issues at all. But yet you come to us saying, here is a man who has perverted this nation, that has stirred up strife, that's trying to turn people away from Rome by claiming that he's the king. He says, I don't see any of this. Now, at this point, was Pilate within his rights to say, you know what, I'm dismissing all charges? Yes, he was. But as I mentioned a few minutes ago, Pilate was too much of a diplomat to do that. He wanted to maintain that diplomacy with the Jewish nation. He didn't want to get called back to Rome. He didn't want to be in trouble with his superiors. So he knew he had to find some ingenious way, some tactic that he could do what he wanted to do, but still placate the Jewish nation. So coming back to where we left off last week, you notice Luke has given us quite a bit more information about these proceedings than what Matthew did. So coming back to where we left off last week, Pilate decides, he says, you know what, I've got an idea. Every year during the Passover, we release a prisoner. Now most of the time it would be a political prisoner or someone that had committed some non-violent crime. He says, I'm going to present two men. He said, one of them is going to be Jesus. He said, and the other one is going to be one that is so heinous that this nation would never choose. Well, Luke tells us a little bit more about Barabbas than what Matthew does. Verse 16, I will therefore chastise him and release him. So he presents this idea to the Jews first. He says, well, how about I just give him a whipping. This is a different term. We'll discuss this also a little bit further on. The term that is here translated chastise is different than the term that we find later on that is defined as scourge. We find that in Roman beatings there were differing levels of extent. There would be some that would be somewhat of a minor whipping. It wouldn't be near as brutal and as extensive as others. But this idea of scourging literally meant to beat someone within an inch of their life. And so his first idea here, he says, well, how about I just whip him? I give him some type of physical punishment and then I turn him loose. Well, that wasn't going to be good enough. Remember, the Jews wanted him dead. They didn't want him beat and released. Well, for of necessity, verse 17, he must release one unto them at the feast. So he was hoping, if I beat Jesus and then present him as one of these two options, then surely they'll think that Jesus has been punished enough. And I can turn him loose. They all cried out at once, saying, away with this man, and release unto us Barabbas. Well, Matthew tells us that Pilate was the one that set forth the name Barabbas. Pilate was the one that gave them the two options, either Jesus or Barabbas. Luke, it seems, is saying that they put forth the name. The Jews put forth that name. I don't see that is the case. I think that whenever we look at the big picture by putting all the gospel accounts together, I think more than likely Luke has not recorded this initial statement where Pilate has put this option out there. But Luke says that they said, no, that's not good enough. We don't want you to beat him and turn him loose. We just want you to turn loose Barabbas and crucify Jesus. Let Barabbas go. Well, you notice verse 19, it says, who for a certain sedition made in this city and for murder was cast into prison. Here was a man who had actually done what they were accusing Jesus of. You notice that? They came before Pilate, they came before Herod, and they said that Jesus was guilty of stirring up seditions, stirring up strife among the people, or an even worse case, stirring up the Jews against the Romans. Well, here you have a man that was guilty of that very thing. Luke tells us that in the city of Jerusalem, and there's a secular historian, I can't remember if it's Josephus or one of the others, that talks a little bit about a sedition that took place shortly before the time that Jesus was arrested. It doesn't mention any names, but most people believe that that's the sedition that this is talking about. And in that, you had a group of Jews who were a part of the group known as the Zealots, those who were a political faction that were bent on driving out the Romans. Well, Barabbas, it would seem, was one of the higher-ups, if not the leader of this group. And they had stirred up many of the Jews in the city of Jerusalem against the Romans. They had taken up arms. They had killed certain of the Roman soldiers and Roman officials that were there before they were finally beat back into submission. And there were a number of those men who were arrested, who were tried, who were found worthy of death. And it would seem that Barabbas was one of those men. So looking at that and thinking about that situation, here was a man whose release could cause the Jewish nation to lose every freedom they had at this point. Because if he got out there again and he stirred the people up against the Romans again, they could lose the right to self-govern. They could lose the right to follow their customs and their practices. They could lose the right to follow after their religion. They could lose all of these things. But yet they said, we want this man. We don't want Jesus. We want you to turn Barabbas loose to us. Well, this brings us to another question. How many times was Jesus beaten before he was crucified? After his arrest, how many times was he beaten before his crucifixion? Well, it depends on which one of the Gospels that you read. Matthew, Mark, and Luke only mention one beating. But if you look at the Gospel of John, he mentions two. If you look at John chapter 19, this is going to pick up immediately where we've left off. John chapter 18 ends this way. Then cried they all again, saying, not this man, but Barabbas. Now Barabbas was a robber. Now, chapter 19 starts this way. Then Pilate, therefore, took Jesus and scourged him. And the soldiers platted a crown of thorns and put it on his head. And they put on him a purple robe and said, Hail, King of the Jews! and they smote him with their hands. Pilate therefore went forth again, and saith unto them, Behold, I bring him forth to you, that you may know that I find no fault in him. Then came Jesus forth, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, and Pilate saith unto them, Behold the man. So, whenever you put the gospel accounts together, we get a more complete picture of what's taking place. Pilate has presented them with this solution. We can either beat Jesus and release him, or we can release Barabbas. Well, they're already crying out, Release Barabbas. Well, by my estimation, in Pilate's mind, he's thinking, well, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to have Jesus beaten. And then I'm going to bring him back before the people again and let them see how much he has suffered. And then present them with this option again. So he has Jesus taken, has him beaten. From the Greek text that is found in this passage, it would seem that this beating was not as severe as what an individual facing execution would receive. It was still severe enough that Jesus would bear the marks on his body, that he would still, it would still be visible that he had suffered at the hands of this beating. But it was not as severe as a scourging received by one sentenced to death. Well, after this beating has taken place, they put a robe on him, put a crown of thorns upon his head, and they bring him back out before the Jews. Pilate is hoping. He is hoping that when they see what he has done to Jesus, that will be enough. He don't want to release Barabbas. He wants to release Jesus, but he also has to find a way to do it where it's going to keep the Jews happy. So he's hoping that this beating is enough. So Jesus comes back before the crowd again. Pilate, paraphrasing, he looks to the crowd and he says, okay, make a decision. Look at what I've already done to this man. Is this not enough? Well, in verse 6 of John 19, it says, when the chief priests, therefore, and the officers saw him, they cried out, crucify him. They weren't even going to consider Barabbas. Crucify him. This beating is not enough. Well, Pilate, once again, he says, but I don't see any reason to. I see no fault in this man. The Jews answered and said, we have a law, and by our law he ought to die, because he made himself the Son of God. Well, when we continue from that point, we see that Pilate began to be afraid. The people are saying we're allowed to self-govern. And according to our laws, we're not talking Roman laws, but according to the law of the Jews, this man has done something worthy of death. And essentially they're saying, Pilate, we really don't need your permission. We really don't care what you think, because our law that he was bound to uphold. Essentially, they tried Jesus. It was just up to Pilate to carry out the sentence. They said, we really don't care what you think. We really don't care if you think he's innocent. We believe he has broken our law. And you have to carry this out. Well, Pilate was afraid. He didn't think Jesus had done anything wrong. In fact, he goes to Jesus and he asks Jesus, what do you think I need to do? How do I need to handle this situation? Folks, how many times do we see judges go to the accused and say, how do I need to handle this? It just doesn't happen that way. But Pilate knew that Jesus was innocent. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong. But Jesus gave him no answer. He said, are you not going to answer even though you know what I have the ability to do? I have the power to put you to death. And Jesus said, thou couldst have no power at all against me, except it were given thee from above. Therefore, he that delivered me unto thee hath the greater sin. He said, the authority that you have, he said, the only way you have that authority is because God gave it to you. And he said, you're simply carrying out that authority. You're carrying out that task. He said, the ones that have brought me to you, the ones that have levied these charges, the ones that actually tried me, he said, they're the ones that this is a great sin against. He said, but you have to carry out the authority that has been given to you. And that authority dictated that he had to uphold the rulings of the Sanhedrin Council. He had to put Jesus to death. Well, Pilate continued to find a way, continued to want to turn him loose, but the Jews were adamant. They did not want Jesus set free. Well, he brought Jesus, brought him out into a public place. You see, Pilate is so conflicted here. On one hand, he knows what his charge from the Romans tell him he has to do. But on the other hand, his conscience, his abilities of reason, not to mention his own wife. Because the Bible tells us that his wife came to him and told him, don't have anything to do with this man. Don't put him to death. He's an innocent man. The text says that it was revealed to her in a dream. Now, there's some speculation as to exactly what that means. There's some that say that God revealed this to her so that she could reveal this to Pilate. I don't necessarily believe that. I don't think that's the case. But I think simply based upon her observations, we know that the gospel began to infiltrate even the household of Caesar very quickly. And so I believe that what this is saying is that due to the things that she had heard, the things that she had witnessed about this man, that it troubled her to the point, and we all understand this, how many times do we agonize even in our dreams over things that are going on in life? We dream about decisions we have to make or the implications of those decisions. She knew that she had to say something, and so she encouraged her husband, have nothing to do with this. So you see, he's being pulled so many different ways. He's got to find the appropriate tactic to use in order to carry out what he feels he needs to do, and that's let Jesus go. So what he finally decides, he decides that he is going to, in a sense, or at least in his mind, remove himself from the equation. He's the one that had to give the charge. But ultimately what he says, go and do what you want, ultimately. So he gives the authority. He says, but I'm not the one that's giving the charge to put this man to death. The Jews are the ones that have brought about that charge. I'm simply giving my men the authority to carry out what the Jews have decided. He brings this bowl of water out there, and I can see this great almost ceremony taking place before them where he washes his hands. He says, you know what? I'm done. Y'all are getting what you want. I'm washing my hands of the whole matter. This isn't on me. This is on you. And at that point, the text says that he gave the order for Jesus to be led away, to be scourged, which would have been that intense beating just prior to execution, and crucified. That's where we're going to stop for this morning. I think that's a good place to stop, and we'll pick up there next Sunday morning.